the Paranormal AF podcast. I'm your host, Rin, and today we are going to talk about the reportedly haunted Old City Hall of Tacoma, which I have touched on a little bit before in my Jake Bird episode. Now, Tacoma has a pretty bad reputation today in 2024, but what a lot of people don't realize is that it has a pretty interesting and rich history, and its original nickname was the City of Destiny, though its alternate nicknames, Grit City or Tacompton, seem more popular at the current moment in time. Even though Tacoma can be a bit of a rough city currently, it still has a lot of interesting sights and more reportedly haunted locations than one might think. I finally made it to Old City Hall back in the fall, and I'm just getting the chance to record this episode now. I got the chance to photograph the outside of the building, which is all anyone has access to currently. Right now, you cannot go inside the building, but hopefully that will be changing because, man, I cannot express to you how badly I want inside this place. You can see that I've included a pic of the building for you to get a feel for the vibe of this impressive structure. Tacoma's Old City Hall was built in 1893, which makes it one of the oldest buildings in the city of Tacoma, which didn't even become incorporated into the city of Tacoma until 1911. Old City Hall actually celebrated its 130th birthday in 2023. The famous bell tower, which is actually considered its own structure, was added in 1898, but the bells weren't installed until 1904, according to my research. One of the important things to note is that the basement of this building was one of the first jails in the city, but the rest of the building was the space for all municipal offices. The city council, shipping and receiving, since we are a port city after all, customs, and the public library. Tacoma stopped using this building as the city hall in the 1950s, and it sat empty for a while. There was talk of demolishing it, but in 1974 the locals succeeded in getting the building placed onto the National Registry of Historic Places. It was around this time, the 70s and 80s, that they tried to turn it into a sort of mall, I guess you could say, and they put a bunch of individual storefronts and some penthouse apartments into the building, but it just didn't take off. Despite the fact that folks here in Tacoma who have lived here since that time have very fond memories of some of the businesses that were housed there during those years. While it does have an owner today, it's been abandoned for all intents and purposes since the late 80s, early 90s. I believe that it was in the early 2000s, from what I've been able to find, that a company did purchase it with the intent to develop it into condos. But that wasn't going according to plan. There were a couple of condos, there were a couple of tenants, but it didn't go the way they wanted it to. There were still a couple of those tenants remaining in the building up until 2008. But that year, one of the fire alarms was tripped, and as a result, the building was flooded with 80,000 gallons of water. The condo project was completely scrapped at that point, and Old City Hall has sat empty ever since. The really exciting news as to the building's future, at least in my opinion, is that the company that currently owns it is working on renovations and plans to use the building for surge co-working, restaurants, retail space, office space, and event spaces. Why am I excited about this? Well, the inside of the building is currently off limits and has been for quite some time. If this company is successful, it means that I and others will finally be able to get inside one of the reportedly most haunted sites in Tacoma. They do have a website dedicated to the project, which I will try to link below for anyone interested, but I couldn't find any sort of timeline on there for when they expect restorations to be complete or anything along those lines. There are many stories of the paranormal associated with this building, even though currently the only people allowed inside are the security guards who patrol it to make sure transients don't break in and set up camp, and those doing the renovations obviously have to be allowed in as well. In 2022, Pretty Gritty Tours was allowed to do a virtual tour of the inside, and I know they had been allowed in at least once before that to do some documentation of the building. For those not from Tacoma, Pretty Gritty Tours is a tour company here in Tacoma, but they are also very involved in cataloging and preserving the history of Tacoma. They have a YouTube channel, which I will link in the description box, and you can check out their videos that give a peek inside Old City Hall. I'm not affiliated with Pretty Gritty Tours in any way, but I am a huge fan of their work, and one of the owners is a fan of ghost stories and things that go bump in the night. His name is Chris Stottinger. And they have some videos about the haunted places here in Washington, and they do offer ghost tours of Tacoma. So because he has a history in journalism, I do like to watch his videos, get the information that he has when I'm researching local haunted places, but he is not my only source of information. We are going to begin with the stories of just outside Old City Hall, because if you happen to visit Tacoma, you might be able to experience this reportedly paranormal activity connected to the building. It's said that if you are standing outside Old City Hall at night, that sometimes people notice a dark hooded figure standing at one of the corners of the building, intensely watching them. People who have witnessed this figure say that when they shine a light in the dark figure's direction or chase after him, he'll duck around the building and disappear. Even if you should happen to be able to get your beam of light on him before he disappears, they claim that you'll still not be able to make out any additional features of the dark figure. He remains just a shadow. Pretty Gritty Tours, which, again, I mentioned earlier, gives a walking tour that includes going by Old City Hall at night, and they report seeing this apparition on some of their tours and having, the guests on their tours actually witness this happening. Generally, people see this shadowy figure and think it's someone in the dark clothing who's following people outside of the building at night. But whether it's witnesses on the walking ghost tour or just people who happen to be coming out of one of the businesses near Old City Hall, once they make it obvious that they see him seeing them, he disappears. Another phenomenon that you might be able to experience outside of the Old City Hall building is the ringing of the bells. And this is the event that I have personally experienced, though I didn't know at the time what I was hearing because I hadn't heard the stories yet. Old City Hall has a bell tower that contains 4 bells. The bell tower was constructed after the main part of the building and is technically considered its own building, even though they are attached. An interesting note on its construction, it was built so that the walls slope slightly inward to give it the illusion of being taller than it actually is. A wealthy local businessman back in the early 1900s had lost his daughter to TB, and he had the bells created and given to the city in her honor. And as I mentioned earlier, they were installed in 1904. It was around March or April of 2021, and we were in that particular part of Tacoma waiting for a bus when we heard the bells ringing. And the reason I remember this and that it stands out is since I didn't know at the time that this was a phenomena, a thing here in Tacoma, the reason why it stood out is because it was such a weird time. It wasn't on the hour, the half hour, or even a quarter past or till the hour. My husband and I looked at each other and were like, oh, cool, bells. But then we looked at each other perplexed because we were like, why are the bells ringing at such an odd time? Also, we had never heard the bells any other time that we were in that part of downtown Tacoma. What we didn't know then is that the clock in the bell tower hasn't worked in around half a century or more. The bells are still hooked up to the clock mechanism, as I understand it, but since the clock doesn't run at all, the bells shouldn't ever ring. But for decades, the bells will ring from time to time, completely randomly, according to some Tacoma residents. No one has figured out why or how. Now, if you do watch the video from Pretty Gritty Tours, you can see that he does manually ring one of the bells in that video. So it can be done, and since it's said that they've been hearing this for decades, we can't say for certain that it wasn't someone who was living in the building in the 2000s. Transients were breaking in and staying in the building after the whole 2008 flooding situation, so some of the ringing could have been due to that. But then they got security. So was one or more of the guards ringing the bells as a sort of prank, knowing the legend surrounding the building? I can't say for sure. I have no clue why the bells ring, but I don't think that we can 100% rule out that it is a physical, alive, flesh and blood person, or even a few someones who have had access to the inside over the years. Remember I said earlier that they tried to turn it into a mall of sorts back in the 70s, 80s? Well, the man who owned it then, according to legend, wasn't a believer in the supernatural. And of course, as legend goes, he didn't believe any of the stories of paranormal encounters that were relayed as having happened there. But the stories of strange things going on in that building go way, way back in its history. As a sort of last hurrah before selling the building, after all of his tenants were out, he decided to spend the night in the empty Old City Hall to prove everyone wrong. He did not believe in the ghost stories at all. While these are legends passed down, they are supposed to be fact, not fiction. But we can all see where the foreshadowing here is going, as if it were written by our favorite horror author. At some point during the night, those infamous bells started to ring. And they kept ringing and kept ringing. His first thought was that it had to be friends of his that had somehow snuck into the building and were messing with him. He runs the whole way up to the top of the building where the bells are, and there is nobody there. Now, if you see the footage of inside the bell tower, there is no way anyone could have been up there and ran back down without running into our intrepid owner at that time. That is a very small stairwell. He claims that while in the bell tower that night, he had been expecting to find some of his friends manually ringing the bells. But what he saw instead was a shadow figure hanging from a rope in the bell tower. And then he saw two other shadow figures that started crawling toward him. And I'm going to be honest here, I've talked before about how I think when we talk about shadow figures in the paranormal community, the reason why we don't all agree on what they are is because there are actually some very different types of entities that appear as shadow people figures. So we're kind of lumping different entities into the same group, and that's why we don't all agree on what they are. For the most part, shadow figures don't creep me out personally. But these shadow figures, the shadow figures reported in Old City Hall, aren't your average shadow figures. They sound more like the stuff of unhinged nightmares. Witnesses report their appearance as slender and lanky, tall, humanoid shapes. In 2024, that bit of a description right there conjures up the idea of Slenderman. But we need to remember that Slenderman is the product of a 2009 creative writing project. This incident we are discussing right here was in the 90s, and the stories of these shadow figures had been going on since long before this. So it's not some sort of version of the Slenderman tale, since all of this predates Slenderman. While these figures do appear humanoid in shape, They are most often reported to be seen crawling for at least a portion of the encounter. In this particular case, they started crawling toward him, and then, as he ran down the stairs to get out of the bell tower, they stood to what he called a towering height to pursue him down the stairs. Many security guards have, and continue, as far as I know, to report seeing these shadow figures on the stairs to the bell tower, on other stairs in the building, and in the hallways as well. Witnesses say they see these shadow figures moving about, often crawling in ways and with a speed that a human could not duplicate. They are often described as scurrying away with joints jutting at weird angles when the guards come across them. But other times they are described as aggressive, chasing those who come upon them rather than scurrying like cockroaches in the light. Do I believe the owner and the security guards? Yes, I do. And while we can't rule out that some flesh and blood person is responsible for the times the bells have rung when they shouldn't, I think that some of the witnesses are very credible, and we can't rule out paranormal activity at Old City Hall. Having seen the video of the inside of the bell tower, I don't believe his friends could have been pranking him, because I think he'd have caught them red-handed. And even if some of the times the bells have rung, it's been due to the living, that doesn't explain the shadow figures on steroids that people see in Old City Hall. I'm not sure I can put into words the vision I get when I hear eyewitness accounts of these things. They tend to crawl, but at abnormally fast speeds, with joints bending and moving at inhuman angles, and when they do stand, they tower over witnesses. With them, people often report feeling impending doom, or at least intense fear that puts them into fight, flight, or fawn. And this makes me wonder about the dark figure that people see outside the building. The description is always the same, so it's not someone there looking for someone to mug, or we'd hear about a rash of attempted muggings or successful muggings in the area. Pretty Gritty Tours wouldn't be taking tour groups through there if there was a person stalking the area and their tour groups. They're safety-minded. And this has happened over a long window of time. It's very unlikely that this is a person, given the odd details of the encounters, and that groups of people have witnessed this together. Which makes me ask the following very unnerving question. Is the dark figure that people report outside of Old City Hall one of the shadow figures from inside, just trying to make themselves blend in a little better? What if they can? You know, the ones that are reported inside the building aren't reported as, like, dressed in black with a black hoodie. So does this mean that they can alter their appearance? And if it is one of the shadow figures from inside the building, why is this particular one outside the building? What does he want? What are his intentions? There have also been a lot of reports by people working in the building of a knocking sound coming from the walls that will follow people around as they move through the building. Over the years, there have been people in the building during the day alone, and they were there for official reasons, right? It is not uncommon for them to report that as they went through the building doing whatever they were hired to be in there doing, that a knocking would follow them throughout the entire building. And remember that for a lot of these instances that we're talking about, there's no power to the building. When it comes to Old City Hall, one of the absolute richest sources of information I have, again, while not my only source, has been Pretty Gritty Tours, because they have documented the inside of this building and their encounters within it. And Chris Dottinger talks about how he's heard this knocking and that there's another mysterious sound that he hears in the building as well. One of the reasons that he is such a big source for this particular video is because he's one of the few people that has been allowed in to document the inside of the building in recent years. There seems to be a theme with this building. People, myself included, get absolutely entranced with the architecture of this building. It's gorgeous. And I've got to tell you, I feel an actual pull towards this building, especially when I'm there in person. I feel incredibly drawn to this building. And yet, even people who love this building, if allowed inside, find themselves wanting to leave, or at least wanting to avoid certain parts of the building between the sounds and the sensations and the stories of shadow people. I don't know about you, but for me, the big questions are whys. Why is this building so haunted? And what is haunting the building? Usually, there's some tragic story that we can point to. But in all of my research on Old City Hall, I haven't found a tragic story. People talk about how the bells were dedicated to the young girl who passed from TB, but I don't think that she had ever set foot in the building. And even if she did, I can't see that such a young girl would have such a strong attachment to a municipal building. I just can't see that she has anything to do with the activity there. I don't see a reason for her spirit to be there, and the activity doesn't fit with what I would expect for a little girl who passed from consumption. Maybe the knocking could be a child spirit, but everything in these paranormal encounters seems menacing on a level that I would not attribute to the spirit of a child. One theory I've heard, I've already discussed in my episode of the Jake Bird Hex, and that theory is that serial killer Jake Bird is the one who haunts Old City Hall. I am not inclined to subscribe to this theory, though. The reason some people believe this to be the case is because, as I mentioned near the beginning of this episode, there was a jail in the basement of the building, and the old cells are still down there, and there is a lot of activity and shadow figures reported in the basement where the cells are. The shadows in the basement, however, are not the same as the Slenderman-esque shadow people we've already discussed, and sometimes voices are heard in the area of the cells as well. This jail was straight up inhumane. These cells that people were housed in were small, not well kept, and there are no windows down there. So no natural light, no fresh air down there. It would not be allowed to function as a jail today. It would be considered cruel and unusual punishment in today's society, and it's probably against the Geneva Convention as well. So to be honest, I could definitely see why an inmate who passed away in there might remain there as an earthbound spirit. Does Jake Bird maybe haunt the old cells, though? I'm going to go with a big doubtful. Bird didn't die in Old City Hall. His execution was in Walla Walla. There are no absolutes, but typically earthbound spirits haunt the place of their death or a place that they were extremely attached to in life. In the grand scheme of things, Bird wasn't housed in Old City Hall that awfully long. But we've already covered how inhumane these cells were. Is it possible that being locked in one of these cells had such a traumatic impact on Bird that his spirit lingers there? I can't say it's a 100% no, but I'd want some evidence collected inside Old City Hall that shows a direct link to Bird before I'm inclined to think it's him haunting the building. But if his spirit does wander there, the most likely place to encounter it would be down in the old cells, I would think. Not on the upper floors or in the bell tower. Again, not impossible, but it doesn't feel probable to me. Also, add in the fact that Bird is also claimed to haunt the squirrel cage prison in Iowa. It seems he's just a figure that people like to blame paranormal activity on, and no, I don't think it's any more likely that Bird haunts that prison either. I've said it before and I'll say it again, I can't tell you how much I want to investigate Old City Hall. I'm hoping that the renovations go well and swiftly, because you best believe the first chance I have to get inside that building, I will be taking it. I have some really big questions that I just can't shake. Why is this building haunted, because I 100% believe that it is just from standing outside of it. What or who is haunting it? In all of the stuff that I've watched and read on this building, I haven't seen anything tragic in its past. Yes, the cells would be considered inhumane, and yes, I can understand maybe some spirits lingering down in the cell area, but is it all former inmates there that are haunting the entire building? But there have been no murders, no traumatic deaths that I could find. In fact, I don't even know how many, if any, of the inmates housed in those jail cells passed there, because they generally were transported somewhere else if they weren't short-term, if you will, inmates, as I understand it. I could be wrong on that. In the incident in 2008, no one was injured, according to what I've read of the event, and even if someone had been, the haunting activity started well before 2008. I have to say, the wording used in the 2008 fire alarm incident makes me wonder if that whole thing isn't sus, the whole flooding of the building. I'm not sure if we know how the fire alarm was triggered. I couldn't find that in any news articles or any videos that I watched on the building. Was it a malfunction in the alarm system? Did a tenant pull the fire alarm? Because when I read about this, or when I hear about this, when I've listened to things on the topic, there is never any mention of a fire in the building. And I didn't see any fire damage in the virtual tour, even though we did see some of the water damage from the incident. Was this simply a case of the fire alarm being pulled by whatever haunts that building? Do the spirits there want it to remain empty? Was it sort of an insurance thing that the person who owned the building at that time wanted out from under it, and so they staged this fire alarm accident? I don't want to accuse anyone. I don't, this is just what if, make believe, pretend, assumptions. This is not fact here. This is me asking why these things happen and just saying, here's different possibilities. What could it have been? I really need to know the who and the why when it comes to this building. But I'm not sure there is or will be a satisfactory answer to those questions. If you've enjoyed this episode, be sure to give this video a thumbs up. Please subscribe if you haven't already. If you've been to this building or have suggestions of haunted places in or around Tacoma that you'd like to see me cover, leave them in the comments down below. Until I see you again, blessings to you.